December 1944, Leyte. The Philippines burns under a low grey sky. A Japanese officer stumbles forward, hands bound, blood crusting at his temple. American guards flank him through the mud. Around them, the wounded lie in rows beneath canvas tents that snap and billow in the wind. The air smells of rain, antiseptic and diesel smoke. He stops, his eyes fix on something impossible. A woman, olive drab uniform, sleeves rolled past her elbows. She moves between the cots with scissors and gauze, her hands steady as she sutures a gash across a soldier's abdomen. An enlisted man hands her instruments without being asked. Another steps aside when she points. She does not ask permission, she commands. The officer's breath catches. In his world, women bow. They serve tea. They wait at home while men decide the fate of nations. But here, in the mud of his defeat, a woman holds life and death in her hands, and the men obey. This is not a story about victory or defeat. It is a story about sight, about the moment when a soldier realizes the world is not what he believed it to be. For 4 years, the Pacific burned. From Pearl Harbor to the coral atolls, from the jungles of Guadalcanal to the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima, two civilizations collided with a ferocity that left millions dead and entire islands reduced to ash. But beneath the artillery and the aircraft carriers, beneath the strategy and the steel, something else was at war. Two ideas of what it meant to be human. In Imperial Japan, the order was absolute. The Bushido Code governed every breath, every step. Men fought, women waited. The emperor was divine, the hierarchy sacred, the roles unbreakable. Women existed to serve honor no tame ni ikiru, to live for men, to nurture the home, to bear sons who would carry the sword. The battlefield was a realm of honor reserved for those born to wield it. To imagine a woman in uniform giving orders flying aircraft was not merely strange, it was unthinkable, obscene, a violation of the natural order itself. America was different. Not perfect, far from it, but different. When the war came, it demanded everything. Factories roared around the clock. Shipyards launched vessels faster than the enemy could sink them. And when the men were not enough, the nation turned to those it had long kept in the margins. Women stepped forward. They enlisted. They welded. They flew. The Women's Army Corps, the Navy Waves, the Women Air Force Service pilots, the Army Nurse Corps serving not in distant hospitals, but in forward zones, under fire, where the dying screamed and the bombs fell close enough to shake the ground beneath their feet. By 1944, over 350,000 women wore the uniform. They were not symbols. They were not morale posters. They were mechanics and radio operators and ferry pilots and surgeons. They were there. And when Japanese soldiers encountered them on airfields, in field hospitals, in the ruins of recaptured islands, they did not understand. How could they? Their entire world had taught them that war was the domain of men alone. But war does not care what we believe. It only reveals what is. This is the story of that revelation. To understand the shock, you must first understand the silence. In Japan, for centuries, women were taught through a text called the Honor Daigaku, the Great Learning for Women. It was not a book of stories or philosophy. It was a manual of erasure. A woman should speak softly, lower her eyes, obey her father, then her husband, then her son. She was the vessel of the household's honor, fragile and pure, to be protected but never elevated. Her virtue lay in her invisibility. When war came, this did not change. It intensified. Japanese propaganda posters showed women in kimono waving white flags as trains carried their sons and husbands toward the front. They appeared at rallies, bowing in unison, voices lifted in songs of sacrifice. They worked in factories, yes, assembling munitions, sewing uniforms, but always under male supervision, always far from the zones of combat. The idea of a woman holding rank, issuing commands, carrying a weapon, was not merely impractical, it was spiritually repugnant. The Imperial Army was a brotherhood of blood and iron. To be a soldier was to embody strength, discipline, the willingness to die without hesitation. Women could not possess these qualities. They were too soft, too emotional, too bound to the cycles of life, to understand the purity of death in service to the emperor. Even the few women who served as nurses did so only in hospitals deep within Japanese-held territory, far from the sound of gunfire, far from the front. War in the Japanese imagination was a masculine sacrament, sacred, inviolable. To a Japanese soldier raised in this tradition, the battlefield was a test of manhood. Every wound, every moment of suffering, every act of courage or cowardice, it all occurred within a space that women could not enter. They were the reason men fought, but never the ones who fought. They were the memory of home, the image held in a soldier's mind as he charged into machine gun fire, pure, distant, untouchable. And so, when intelligence reports began to filter back from the Pacific rumors of American women in uniform operating radios, piloting aircraft, treating the wounded under bombardment, they were dismissed. Propaganda, surely. A trick. The Americans were known for their theatrics, their obsession with spectacle. Perhaps they dressed women in costumes for photographs for morale, but to actually trust them with responsibility, with authority, with the machinery of war, impossible. No rational military would do such a thing. The Japanese command did not believe the reports, because belief would have required them to imagine a world where the foundations of civilization had been overturned, where women were not symbols but actors, not protected but capable, not silent but commanding, and they could not imagine such a world. Even as American forces advanced island by island, even as the tide of the war turned and Japanese soldiers found themselves retreating, surrendering, taken prisoner, they still did not believe. They thought the reports were exaggerations, misunderstandings, errors in translation, until they saw it themselves. Until a captured officer, bleeding and exhausted, was led through an American field hospital and watched a woman in uniform calmly suture a wound, give orders, move through the chaos, with the assurance of someone who had earned her place. Until a pilot shot down and dragged from the wreckage of his Zero, looked up and saw a woman's face beneath the brim of a service cap speaking to him in broken Japanese, telling him he was safe now. Until the impossible became undeniable. The enemy they had been taught to despise as weak, as decadent, as corrupted by modernity, that enemy had done something Japan could not even conceive of. It had asked its women to step forward, and they had answered. To the Japanese soldier, this was not progress, it was madness, and yet it was real. America did not begin the war believing in equality. It stumbled into it out of necessity. When the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, the nation was still a patchwork of contradictions. Women could vote, but in many places they could not serve on juries. They could work, but rarely in positions of authority. They were teachers and secretaries and nurses' roles that extended the domestic sphere outward, but never shattered it. The idea of a woman in combat boots her hands on the controls of a bomber was as foreign to most Americans as it was to the Japanese. But war is a ruthless educator. By 1942, the factories were screaming for workers. The shipyards in California, the aircraft plants in Kansas, the munitions depots scattered across the heartland. They needed hands, and the men were gone. 16 million of them shipped overseas, swallowed by the vast machinery of global conflict. The nation had a choice: slow production and risk losing the war, or open the gates. It opened the gates. Women flooded into the factories. They welded the hulls of Liberty ships. They riveted the fuselages of B-17 flying fortresses. They assembled the engines of Sherman tanks and the wings of P-51 Mustangs. Rosie the Riveter was not just a poster, she was millions of women in coveralls and headscarves, their hands blistered and strong, their presence reshaping the landscape of labor itself. But the military was slower to adapt. The generals resisted, the politicians hesitated. There were questions of propriety, of capability, of what it would mean to place women in uniform. Would it undermine morale? Would it distract the men? Would it work? And then the need became too great to ignore. In 1942, the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps was created later, renamed the Women's Army Corps. They started in administrative roles, clerks and typists and telephone operators. But as the war expanded, so did their responsibilities. They analyzed intelligence. They operated radar stations. They decoded enemy transmissions. They became the backbone of communication networks stretching from Washington to the front lines. The Navy followed. The waves women accepted for volunteer emergency service took over roles in navigation, aviation mechanics, and logistics. They were not allowed on combat ships, but they kept the fleet moving, maintained the aircraft, ensured that the machinery of war functioned without pause. And then there were the pilots. The Women Air Force Service Pilots WASPs were perhaps the most audacious experiment of all. Over 1,800 women trained to fly military aircraft, not as passengers, not as novelties, as pilots. They ferried fighters and bombers from factories to bases, towed targets for live gunnery practice, tested repaired aircraft to ensure they were airworthy. Some flew planes fresh off the assembly line, engines untested, hoping the wings would not fall off mid-flight. Others transported cargo across oceans through storms over mountains, where a single miscalculation meant death. They wore the same wings, faced the same dangers. 38 of them died in service, crashes, engine failures, weather. But because they were classified as civilians, their families received no military honors, no flags, no recognition, yet they flew. By 1944, over 350,000 American women had enlisted in non-traditional roles. They were not there to comfort or entertain. They were there because the mathematics of total war required it. Roosevelt's arsenal of democracy could not afford to exclude half its population. Survival demanded efficiency. Efficiency demanded inclusion. The Japanese could not understand this. To them, it looked like desperation. A nation so weakened, so lacking in men, that it had to send women into the field. They saw it as evidence of American decadence, proof that the enemy was on the verge of collapse. They did not see it for what it was, a redefinition of strength itself. The engine of American power was not its tanks or its ships. It was its willingness to use every resource, every mind, every capable hand, regardless of who it belonged to. War had no gender, only outcomes. The first time is always the hardest to believe. Philippines, late 1944. The mud is everywhere, thick red, clinging to boots and equipment like something alive. The jungle steams in the aftermath of rain. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbles a low thunder that never quite stops. The American advance has pushed inland, and with it comes the machinery of occupation, supply lines, command posts, field hospitals, erected in clearings hacked from the jungle. Japanese soldiers captured or wounded are brought in under guard. Some walk. Others are carried on stretchers, their uniforms torn and stained, their faces blank with exhaustion or shock. They have fought for months, retreating step by step, watching their lines collapse, their comrades die. They expect brutality. They expect execution. The propaganda has told them what happens to prisoners of the Americans: torture, humiliation, death. Instead, they are brought to a tent. Inside, the air is sharp with the smell of iodine and blood. Cots line the walls. Men lie groaning, some unconscious, some staring at nothing. Medical personnel move between them, doctors in stained whites, corpsmen with their sleeves rolled up, their movements quick and efficient. And among them, a woman. She wears olive drab, the same uniform as the men. Her hair is pinned back beneath a cap. Her hands move without hesitation, checking pulses, adjusting IVs, issuing instructions in a low, steady voice. A corpsman hands her a scalpel. She makes an incision, clears debris from a wound, sutures it closed. Her face is calm, focused. There is no fear in her, no uncertainty. The Japanese soldiers watch in silence. One of them, an officer with a shattered arm, refuses to lie down. He stands near the entrance, swaying slightly, his eyes fixed on her. A translator speaks to him in Japanese, urging him to cooperate, to let them treat him. He does not respond. He only stares. Another nurse approaches a woman in her 30s, her uniform splattered with mud. She kneels beside a wounded Japanese soldier, a boy barely old enough to shave his leg mangled below the knee. She speaks softly in English, but her tone is gentle. She cleans the wound, applies a bandage, gives him water. He flinches at first, then accepts it, his eyes wide with confusion. The officer near the entrance finally speaks. His voice is hoarse, barely audible over the noise of the tent. The translator listens, then turns to one of the American doctors. He says he does not understand. He asks why women are here. He asks if they are prisoners too. The doctor pauses, looks at the officer, then back at the translator. Tell him they're nurses. They're here to help. The translator relays the message. The officer's expression does not change, but something shifts behind his eyes, a flicker of disbelief of something deeper. He looks at the woman suturing the wound, at the other nurses moving through the tent, and for the first time since his capture, his composure cracks. He sits down heavily on the ground, his bound hands resting in his lap. Later, in interrogation reports, captured soldiers would describe this moment in their own words. We saw women among the Americans. They wore uniforms. They carried pistols. They spoke with authority, and the men obeyed them. Some refused treatment at first, believing that to be touched by a woman in such a context was dishonorable, a violation of everything they had been taught. Others simply stared, unable to reconcile what they were seeing with the world they knew. For these men, the war had already been lost. Their emperor's forces were in retreat, their cities were being bombed, their navy lay scattered across the ocean floor. But this was a different kind of defeat, not of arms, but of understanding. They had been told the Americans were weak, that their society was fractured, decadent, unworthy of respect, that their reliance on machines and industry betrayed a lack of spirit of discipline. But here in the mud and rain, under fire and exhaustion, the Americans had done something Japan could not imagine. They had trusted their women with the work of war, and it was working. There is something mythical about flight, something that exists beyond the practical, beyond the mechanics of lift and thrust. To fly is to touch the realm of gods, to transcend the earth and everything that binds us to it. For centuries, it belonged only to dreams and legends until the 20th century made it real. And then, for a brief moment in history, it belonged to women too. The women Air Force service pilots were never supposed to exist. When Jacqueline Cochran first proposed the idea to General Henry Arnold in 1941, the response was skepticism. Women flying military aircraft, ferrying bombers across continents. It was not a matter of skill. Cochran herself was one of the most accomplished pilots in America, but of precedent, of tradition, of what people would say. But the war did not care what people would say. By 1943, the program was operational. Women arrived at Avenger Field in Sweetwater, Texas, a flat expanse of dust and sky where the wind never stopped blowing. They came from every corner of the country, secretaries and college students, barnstormers and flight instructors, women who had learned to fly in borrowed planes or on their family's farm. Some had hundreds of hours in the cockpit, others were still learning. They trained in open cockpit biplanes, then graduated to advanced trainers. They learned navigation, meteorology, formation, flying instrument flight. They learned what to do when an engine failed at altitude, when ice formed on the wings, when the weather closed in, and the ground disappeared beneath a blanket of cloud. They learned how to fly like the military flew, with precision, with discipline, without hesitation. And then they were given the keys to the most powerful aircraft in the American arsenal. B-17 Flying Fortresses, B-2 Fort Liberators, P-50 Sutu Mustangs, P-38 Lightnings. They ferried them from factories to bases, from bases to ports, from one coast to the other, and sometimes beyond. They flew through storms and across mountains, navigating by compass and dead reckoning when the radios failed. They flew planes fresh off the assembly line, untested engines roaring with uncertainty. If something went wrong, if a part had been installed incorrectly, if the fuel mixture was off, if the wings could not take the strain, they would be the first to know. 38 of them died. Engine fires, mid-air collisions, crashes on takeoff or landing, weather that turned lethal without warning. Their families received telegrams, condolences, but no military honors, no flags, no recognition. They were civilians technically contracted by the Army Air Forces, but not part of it. Their deaths were recorded in logbooks and forgotten, yet they kept flying. By the end of the war, the Wasps had ferried over 12,000 aircraft. They had flown 60 million miles, the equivalent of circling the Earth 2,400 times. They had towed targets for gunnery practice, the student gunners firing live rounds, while the women held the tow cable steady. They had tested repaired bombers, taking them up to see if the mechanics had done their job correctly, knowing that if they hadn't, there would be no ejection seat, no parachute, no second chance. And the Japanese heard about this. Intelligence reports filtered through prisoner interrogations, through intercepted communications, through the slow, grinding machinery of wartime information gathering. Reports of women flying combat aircraft, women ferrying bombers, women in the cockpit alone, thousands of feet above the earth. The Japanese command did not believe it. It had to be propaganda. A trick. Women were not capable of such things, not physically, not mentally, not spiritually. The demands of high-altitude flight, the cold, the thin air, the G-forces in a dive, these were things that required masculine strength, masculine endurance. But the reports kept coming. And after the war, in the quiet rooms, where defeated officers were asked to explain what had gone wrong, some of them spoke of this, not with anger, but with a kind of bewildered respect. They could not comprehend a nation that gave wings to its women, that trusted them with machines of war. That allowed them to risk their lives not as symbols or sacrifices, but as pilots. Even in defeat, they could not reconcile it with what they believed the world to be. The sky they thought belonged to men, but the women flew anyway. There is a special kind of courage required to walk toward danger without a weapon. The Army Nurse Corps and Navy Nurse Corps did not carry rifles. They did not pilot aircraft or command infantry. They had no artillery, no armor, no means of defense except their wits and the thin canvas of a field hospital tent. Yet they went where the war was loudest, into the forward zones, into the places where men screamed and bled and died faster than anyone could count. They went because someone had to. Guadalcanal, 1942. The first major American offensive in the Pacific. The island is a fever dream of jungle and heat where malaria kills as efficiently as bullets, and the nights are split by the roar of Japanese naval bombardment. The field hospitals are little more than tents staked into the mud, surrounded by sandbags and prayer. Inside, the wounded arrive in waves, carried on stretchers, stumbling on their own, some already grey with shock. The nurses work without stopping, 16-hour shifts, 20-hour shifts. Time loses meaning when the casualties keep coming. They triage in the dim glow of kerosene lamps, deciding who can be saved and who cannot, making choices that will haunt them for the rest of their lives. They administer plasma-clean wounds, assist in surgeries performed on plywood tables with instruments sterilized in boiling water. They hold the hands of dying boys who call for their mothers and tell them it will be okay even when it won't be. And when the Japanese bombers come, when the explosions walk across the compound and the earth shakes and the tents collapse, they do not run, they stay. One nurse stationed on Bataan in the Philippines described the moment when the order came to evacuate. Japanese forces were advancing. The hospital was in their path. Most of the medical staff were ordered out, but some of the nurses refused. There were still wounded who could not be moved. Someone had to stay. So they did, working through the night as the sound of gunfire grew closer until the last patient was stable enough to transport. By the time they evacuated, the enemy was less than a mile away. Leyte, 1944. The American returned to the Philippines. The campaign is brutal, a grinding urban nightmare where every street is contested and the casualties mount faster than the supply lines can handle. Field hospitals are set up in schools, churches, abandoned buildings, anywhere with a roof. The nurses work in blood-soaked aprons, their hands chapped and raw, their eyes red from exhaustion and smoke. Japanese prisoners are brought in among the American wounded. At first, there is hesitation. Some of the prisoners refuse treatment, believing that to accept help from the enemy, especially from women, is an unforgivable dishonor. But pain has a way of breaking through ideology. A nurse kneels beside a Japanese soldier with a shattered leg, speaks softly in English, offers water. He hesitates, then drinks. She cleans the wound, applies a bandage, moves on to the next patient. Later, through a translator, the soldier asks why she helped him. She does not understand the question. He is wounded. That is enough. The Japanese soldiers who survived the war and spoke of their captivity often mentioned the nurses, not with bitterness, but with confusion. They had been taught that Americans were barbaric, that their society was weak and corrupt. Yet these women, who by all logic should have been far from the battlefield, safe in some distant city, were here in the mud and chaos, saving lives without regard for uniform or nationality. It made no sense. In Japan, compassion was a private virtue, something expressed within the family, within the community. To extend it to the enemy was incomprehensible. Weakness, a failure of resolve. But here it was made visible in the steady hands of women who carried no weapons, yet walked through fire. They had no rank that inspired fear, no authority that came from violence. Yet the men around them, American soldiers, officers, even prisoners, responded with something deeper than obedience: respect. To the Japanese, this was the strangest thing of all. Not that women served, but that they were valued for it. That their presence was not tolerated, but essential. War was supposed to reveal who was strong and who was weak. But these women had redefined what strength meant. The war ends not with a single moment, but with a slow exhale. Surrender, occupation. The machinery of violence grinding to a halt, replaced by the machinery of accounting. Prisoners are processed, interrogated
Thank you so
their
much.
stories, recorded in typewritten reports that will gather dust in archives for decades. It is in these reports that the truth emerges, not the truth of battles won or lost, but the truth of what the defeated saw and could not explain. Allied intelligence officers sit across from Japanese prisoners in bare rooms, translators between them, stenographers recording every word. The questions are practical at first: unit designations, troop movements, supply lines. But as the interrogations continue, something else surfaces: a pattern, a recurring note of disbelief. The Americans had women in their military. The statement appears again and again in different phrasings, different contexts, but always with the same undertone of astonishment. Not anger, not contempt, astonishment. One officer captured on Okinawa describes being marched through an American encampment. He expected to see soldiers, men hardened by combat, moving with the efficiency of a disciplined force, and he did see that. But he also saw women. They wore the same uniforms, carried clipboards, radios, medical kits. They walked with purpose, spoke with authority. Enlisted men saluted them. Officers consulted them. I did not understand, he tells the interrogator. In our army, women do not exist in such places. They are at home. They wait. But here, a woman told a soldier to move a supply crate, and he obeyed her without question. She did not ask. She commanded. Another prisoner, a pilot shot down over the Philippines, recounts his capture. He was dragged from the wreckage of his Zero injured but alive. The Americans who found him were cautious, weapons raised, expecting resistance. But when they saw he was unarmed and wounded, they called for a medic. The medic was a woman. She examined my injuries, he says, his voice quiet. She spoke to me in broken Japanese. She told me I would be fine. I remember thinking, this cannot be real. This is a dream, a hallucination. But it was not. She bandaged my wounds. She gave me water. And when I looked around, there were other women. Working. Not prisoners, not servants, soldiers. The interrogator asks him what he thought in that moment. He pauses for a long time before answering. I thought that we had been lied to, about everything. The transcripts are clinical, stripped of emotion, but the emotion is there beneath the surface. These are men whose entire worldview has been shattered, not just by military defeat, but by the realization that the enemy they had been taught to despise was fundamentally different from what they had imagined. The Americans were not weak. They were not decadent. They were not collapsing under the weight of their own permissiveness. They were winning because they used every resource available to them, including their women. For the Japanese soldiers, this was more disorienting than the technology. The aircraft carriers, the bombers, the radar, and the industrial capacity, these were things that could be understood even if they could not be matched. But this, the presence of women in roles of authority, in positions of danger, treated not as aberrations, but as integral parts of the war effort. It violated everything they had been taught about order, about hierarchy, about the natural structure of the world. One prisoner, an enlisted man from a rural village, tries to explain it to the interrogator. In my home, women work in the fields. They are strong, yes, but war is different. War is for men. It has always been for men. To see a woman wearing the uniform carrying responsibility, it is like seeing the sky below you and the earth above. It makes no sense. But it is there. The interrogator presses him. Did it affect morale? Did it make the Americans seem weaker? The man shakes his head. No, it made them seem infinite. As if they had twice as many people. As if there was no end to them. Another prisoner is more direct. We were told they were soft, that their women made them weak. But a nation that allows its women to fight, that trusts them with power, that nation does not lack resolve. It has more than we do. The words are recorded, filed, forgotten for years, but they remain. Wars end, but their echoes linger for generations. When the occupation came, it came with jeeps and clipboards, with military governors and reconstruction plans, with the weight of a victor trying to reshape a defeated nation in its own image. General Douglas MacArthur arrived in Tokyo like a figure from mythology, cigarette between his lips, aviator sunglasses catching the light. He brought with him not just troops, but ideas: democracy, universal suffrage, constitutional reform, and women in uniform. The Japanese saw them everywhere. WACs directing traffic, Navy personnel coordinating supply shipments, nurses setting up clinics in bombed-out neighborhoods. They were not there as symbols or spectacles. They were there working with the same authority and competence as their male counterparts. They moved through the ruins of Tokyo, Osaka, Hiroshima, and the Japanese people watched. For many, it was their first direct encounter with the reality they had only heard about in whispers and interrogation reports. These were not propaganda images. These were flesh and blood women speaking English and bad Japanese distributing food processing paperwork, helping to rebuild what the war had destroyed. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Japanese women had spent the war years in factories and fields working themselves to exhaustion. Yes, but always in the shadows, always under male supervision, always with the understanding that their role was temporary, a wartime necessity, thing that would end the moment the men returned. Now they saw American women who had not stepped back, who wore rank insignia and carried authority that did not diminish with the peace. It planted a seed. The new Japanese constitution, drafted under American oversight and promulgated in 1947, included Article 24, a guarantee of gender equality in marriage, property rights, and inheritance. Women received the right to vote. The legal framework that had defined them as perpetual dependents was dismantled. It was not a gift. It was not charity. It was a recognition, however imperfect, that the old order had failed catastrophically. And part of that failure was visible in the contrast. The Americans had mobilized their entire society. The Japanese had mobilized half. In the years that followed, Japanese media began to shift. Films and magazines that had once portrayed women solely as mothers and wives now included images of women in professional roles, teachers, doctors, journalists. The imagery was cautious, incremental, but it was there. The war had opened a window that could not be fully closed. Veterans returning home found a country transformed. Some resisted. Many clung to the old ways, insisting that the presence of women in public life was a symptom of occupation of foreign contamination. But others, especially the younger generation, saw it differently. They had fought against a nation that used every resource. They had lost to a nation that did not waste half its potential. The lesson was there, whether they wanted to learn it or not. By the 1,950 seconds, Japanese women were entering universities in greater numbers. By the 1,960 seconds, they were joining corporations, albeit in limited roles. By the 1,970 seconds, they were running for political office. The progress was slow, uneven, frequently met with resistance. Japan did not become a model of gender equality overnight. It still has not. But something had changed. The image of the woman in uniform, calm, competent, unafraid, lingered in the cultural memory. It became a reference point, a counter-argument, a proof that another way was possible. The Japanese soldiers who had stared in disbelief at American nurses and pilots carried that image with them for the rest of their lives. Some spoke of it with bitterness, others with grudging respect. A few with something close to admiration. The war had been fought with guns and bombs and aircraft carriers, but it had also been fought with ideas, with assumptions about who could do what, who deserved authority, who was allowed to be strong, and on that front Japan had lost before the first shot was fired. The empire fell not just because it ran out of ships and planes, but because it never understood that power in the modern world was not about who you excluded. It was about who you included. The women who served American nurses, pilots, mechanics, clerks did not set out to change Japan. They set out to win a war. But in winning, they showed another world what was possible. And some people, even among the defeated, were watching. History remembers the battles, the names of islands and the dates of invasions. Midway, Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. It remembers the generals and the admirals, the strategies and the sacrifices. But it often forgets the quiet revolutions that happen in the margins, the shifts in perception that change everything without a single shot fired. The women who served in World War II did not fight for recognition. Most did not receive it. The WASPs were disbanded in 1944. Their records sealed their service unacknowledged by the military for over 30 years. The nurses came home to a nation that wanted to forget the war, to move on to return to normalcy. Many of them never spoke about what they had seen or done. But the Japanese soldiers who encountered them carried that memory differently. For them, it was not just a footnote, it was a revelation. They had expected to fight men. They faced a nation that made no distinction. The shock of that encounter rippled outward through prisoner of war camps, through post-war interrogations, through the slow cultural awakening of a defeated society trying to understand where it had gone wrong. Japan's military defeat was obvious, measurable in sunken ships and burned cities. But the ideological defeat was harder to quantify. It lived in the quiet moments of disbelief, in the questions that had no comfortable answers. How did they lose to a nation that trusted women with power? The answer was simple and devastating. America's innovation was not just mechanical, it was human. A society that could adapt, that could use every mind and every pair of hands, was stronger than one bound by rigid tradition. Inclusion was not weakness, it was the hidden front of modern war. And Japan had never even realized the battle was being fought. December 1944. A field hospital in the Philippines. A Japanese officer stares at a woman in uniform and sees something he cannot name. Not just the enemy, not just a soldier. The future. The war will end. The empire will fall. The cities will burn and rebuild. The soldiers will go home, or they will not go home, and the world will turn and turn until the names and the faces fade into history. But this moment remains. A woman moving through the wounded with steady hands. A woman at the controls of a bomber 30,000 feet above the earth. A woman issuing orders, saving lives, carrying the weight of responsibility that her society had finally, reluctantly, imperfectly allowed her to bear. The Japanese officer could not understand it. Perhaps he never did, but he saw it. And in seeing it, something shifted. War changes men. It breaks them, hardens them, teaches them what they are capable of and what they are not. But equality, true, equality changes history. It redefines who gets to be strong, who gets to matter, who gets to shape the world. The women who served did not wait for permission. They did not ask to be believed. They simply were. And in a muddy field hospital under a grey Philippine sky, a defeated soldier finally understood. The world had already moved on without him.